I'm going to start by reading Jesus' introduction here. Starting in verse 1, Matthew chapter 23. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long, and they love the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." I wanted to start with Jesus' introduction to this passage because as we go on, Jesus is going to be critiquing the Pharisees and the scribes. And we're a culture that loves to pour gasoline to the fire of criticism and to all sorts of social media posts that are dogging on certain people or institutions or leaders. We are very easily on the hype train of shouting those people down. But what we're not so good at is noticing that Jesus starts his address to the scribes and Pharisees by addressing his disciples and the crowd. Jesus is talking primarily to his disciples and the crowds about spiritual leadership in this passage. He's not talking directly to the Pharisees, although he is addressing them. He wants the crowds and his disciples, who will be the leaders of the church, to learn from the mistakes of the Pharisees and the scribes and their spiritual leadership. And so I want us to hear this, because Jesus is trying to teach his disciples about what true spiritual leadership looks like. And as he says at the end of his introduction here, "The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." Jesus sets himself up as the epitome of spiritual leadership for his people, and he wants us to learn from him about what servant leadership is all about. And see, leadership is not limited just to me, the guy who stands up here on Sunday mornings and talks, but in many senses, it goes out to all of us. Whether we're small group leaders, or we're leaders within our workplaces, we're leaders within our ministries that we serve in on a Sunday morning, whether in children's ministry, worship ministry, whatever ministries we serve in, we are all in some capacities wielding our influence upon other people in those capacities. And Jesus wants to teach us about what true and healthy, godly, spiritual leadership looks like today. And so this is a sermon that I'm preaching especially to myself, in light of the fact that I know how many leaders have fallen in our day and age. You can just Google fallen pastors, and you'll find dozens of stories of pastors who have had moral failures, who've had all sorts of failures that have led them to be able to have to step down from the pulpit. So this is just as much for me as it is for all of us today. The two main issues that Jesus has with the Pharisees and scribes are this: it's their hypocrisy and their pride. their hypocrisy and their pride. So as we dive into these woes against the Pharisees, I want us to first focus on the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, and then we will dive into the pride of the Pharisees. Open up your Bibles again here to, Matthew 23. We'll skip around a little bit in this passage today. We're going to start actually right now in verse 25, reading about their hypocrisy. Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that the outside also may be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." See, what I imagine here when Jesus is talking about a cup that is clean on the outside but dirty on the inside is, in our day and age, many of us are fans of the insulated cups that we get to use, and all of us have our favorites, I think. And so if you look on the inside of your favorite Yeti cup, you're probably going to notice the lots of lines that have stacked up over time from your coffee stains, right? But on the outside, it's pristine, it's put together, it's a beautiful Yeti. There, perhaps your engraving is still on there from the time you got it. But the inside is full of stains and dirty. And it's the same with tombs, right? We all can go and visit gravesides and enjoy looking at the tombstones of our forefathers. But yet we know that on the inside of that, their bones are there, and they're dead and unclean. And see, the Pharisees had lots of external righteousness to make them look pleasant to those who saw them. Jesus pointed out in his introduction that they have these things called phylacteries, which are these small boxes of scripture that they would wear across their head for everyone to be able to see. Or he talks about their fringes, otherwise called tassels, these things that they would put onto their sleeves that God had commanded the Israelites to wear in the Old Testament to remind them of God and of the covenant. And these long tassels that would flow all over their hands. Think of 70s kind of hippie wear that you would have flowing all over you, right? Not only this, but Jesus critiques in the Sermon on the Mount their long prayers that they would pray on the streets, their fasting that they would announce to the world around them. The Pharisees had all signs of external righteousness to the world, that they had their lives put together and things were buttoned up and pretty. But they didn't have a changed heart. Remember Jesus' teachings in other parts of Matthew that we've covered, where Jesus says things like, "What comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit." These are different wise sayings of Jesus throughout the Gospel of Matthew to teach us that what truly matters for a disciple of Jesus Christ is not the outer life that they put on for other people, but is the inner life that they cultivate before God. And we learned about this in the Sermon on the Mount, right? Where Jesus criticizes the public prayer of the Pharisees. He tells us to go into our prayer closets and pray to our Father in secret. He says, don't fast to be seen by others, but wash your face. Fast so that you may be able to be pleasing to your heavenly Father. Jesus wants us to cultivate a heart of obedience to him. Or, as another wise proverb says from the Old Testament, keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. See, if you and I cultivate lives that are full of sin on the inside but outwardly appear righteous, we're going to be like a well that has been poisoned. And no matter how much water you draw out of that well, that water is always going to be poisoned. And so we have to be able to cleanse the inside of our hearts. We have to be able to keep an inner heart of obedience to Jesus. This is the heart of hypocrisy. Being one thing on the outside, but being another thing on the inside. Saying before others that you're a Christian, but yet not cultivating a true life of holiness and prayer and scripture study before God in the quiet places of your life and of your mind and of your heart. And so the question for us then is, how do we know if we're a hypocrite? How do you know if this is you and if you have the problem that Jesus is describing here? Well, I'm here to tell you even worse news, is that you probably don't know. You probably don't know if you're a hypocrite. Hypocrites will not say, I'm a hypocrite. That is not the type of people that they are. Someone has to tell you, just as Jesus is telling the Pharisees here. And so just as Angela was encouraging our e-groups, our small groups earlier today, I would encourage you that if you're a Christian, you cannot allow your whole entire Christian life to be defined by someone from a pulpit telling you how to live the Christian life. That's not going to lead to a changed Christian life for you. But a truly changed Christian life is one lived in open and honest community with others. It's one where we open the scriptures together and we look at passages like this one together and we say, am I like this Pharisee here? Am I this scribe here? This is why so much of the New Testament, so much of the Old Testament, so much of the Bible, I don't have the exact percentage on me today, but it is over half of the Bible is written in narrative. Do you know why it's written in narrative? It's so that you and I can read those stories and ask ourselves the question, who am I in this story? It's to be reflective to us, to teach us, to help us see morals lived out, the inner life played out in front of other people. And it's to help us have these self-reflective questions in community together and ask ourselves the hard questions. Who am I in this story? So that's the first aspect of ways to avoid a hypocrisy, is to pursue open, honest relationships where you confess sin and look inside your heart for sins often. And secondly, I would encourage you to pursue a private life of prayer. If you don't have a time in your week or your day where you spend even 5 minutes before God by yourself, allowing Him to look inside of you and to peer at your soul and your heart with the scriptures open before you, you need to do that soon. Because it's in those moments that Jesus reveals our hypocrisy at a level that makes us shiver. So Jesus warns of hypocrisy, but He also warns of pride. And I had a harder time labeling this one. I didn't know if pride was the exact right label for it. The other label that I was tempted to place on this was tribalism. And I think you'll understand why in a moment. But again, look with me at some of these things that Jesus says against the Pharisees, starting in verse 13. 3 of the other 7 woes that He lays upon them here. He says this, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. For you neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte." That's simply a convert. A proselyte is a convert. And when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Woe to you blind guides who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? And you say, if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, he is bound by his oath. You blind men, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. See, the Pharisees were people who were full of pride. They wanted to not make people who followed God, they wanted to make more Pharisees. See, the problem with the Pharisees was not that they cared about following Jesus. They didn't want people to follow Jesus. They didn't want people to follow God. They wanted people to follow their version and interpretation of the law. They wanted them to follow their version of God, their version of Judaism. They wanted to make converts to their tribe. They did not want to make converts to God. See, they were jealous of the fact that people were following Jesus. They wanted to get people back from him. See, Matthew tells us later in his gospel that the reason that they wanted to crucify Jesus was out of envy and jealousy. Why is that? Because Jesus was getting the followers and they were not. Sounds a lot like today's world, doesn't it? See, when people care about leading people to their brand of church, or perhaps even to their celebrity pastor, more than they care about leading people to Jesus, that should be a telltale sign of a prideful, arrogant leader. Not only this, but the other sign of their pride or their tribalism is that they majored on the minor. Here's what I mean by that. They took minor issues of faithfulness and made them the major issues of faithfulness. What did the Pharisees do? Well, as we read earlier, they wanted people to swear by the gold in the temple, but not by the God in the temple. They said, if you want to really be faithful to swear to God, you don't need to just swear to God in the temple. You need to swear by the gold that sits on the altar that sits in the temple. And then if you do that, then you're going to be faithful to God and swearing to him there. Majoring on the minor. What else did they do? They tithed mint and dill and cumin. Can't you just imagine them pouring out their mint on the table, and they're like, all right, here we go. Get out my razor here real quick and spread it out real quick. Get 10% of that, and I'm going to give that to the 10% over here of the temple. But yet they walk out of the temple, and there's a poor beggar sitting there on the side of the temple, and they ignore him. That's what these Pharisees would do, majoring on the minor. What else did they do? Jesus points this out. He says they would take their wine that they would drink, and they would take a little strainer, and they would pour the wine through the strainer to make sure that all the little gnats that got into that wine were out of it, because they can't have anything unclean in their wine. That would just be the worst. But Jesus says they would strain that out, but they would swallow the camel of their hypocrisy. Again, majoring on the minor. See, the Pharisees prided themselves in these things that set them apart from other people. They said, these little things, if you do them, you will be holy before God. And I don't know if you've seen those brands of Christianity before that also major on the minor. The amount of church disunity and discord that has occurred over the colors of carpet, over disagreements over small nuances in worship style, in music, or apparel on a Sunday morning. All these small details of faithfulness get focused on rather than the major points of faithfulness to Jesus Christ. Not only that, but they'll take even more important issues. It's not to say that some of these things that the Pharisees are talking about aren't important. Tithing, right? Being able to be holy to God in both body and word. They cared about those things, right? And we care about some of those things today too, but the problem is that people in our world will major on the secondary or tertiary issues of the church and make those the major issues of the church. Let me give you an example of that. You find a church that wants to sell you a specific style of the end times. And they'll say, this is the way that Jesus is going to come back in this time, in this way, and we need to be prepared in this way for that time. And they'll make their whole church around that one topic. When at the end of the day, faithful Christians can just disagree about that stuff. We can say, like, Jesus is going to come back. We for sure know that. How he's going to do that, exactly when he's going to do that, what it's going to look like for us, we can disagree on that. But we know that we believe Jesus is going to come back. So rather than majoring on the minors, we need to try to major on the majors. So how do we combat pride in our lives? It's through two things. It's lifting up Jesus rather than yourself. See, churches, Christians who make it more about Jesus than their particular brand of Christianity, than their particular leader, those are the Christians that you need to follow. Not only that, but as Jesus told us in the beginning, we need to become a servant to others rather than trying to make others a servant to us. How many times do we try to get people to bend to our opinions on things or our specific moral application of something within the Christian life rather than just trying to serve them as Christ has served us? If we can do those things, make it about Jesus and serve others, love God and love others, then we're doing pretty well in life. But before we end this time, I want to specifically talk about leadership in the church. Because the reason that Jesus is calling out the Pharisees, publicly calling them out, is because the people followed them. People listened to them. There were people who wanted to be like the Pharisees. Believe it or not, as much as we try to demonize them in our day and age, they were people just trying to follow God. And they were some twisted ideas. They got messed up. But they were actually trying to follow God. And so other people followed them too. Jesus is calling them out because they're the leaders. And so we need to talk about leadership for us today. See, we live, as I mentioned earlier, in a day and age where Christian leaders are falling all of the time. All of the scandals that you can look up in the world, they're happening all the time. And the reason is not just because these pastors aren't good at public speaking. It's not because these pastors don't have charisma. It's not because they don't have some natural leadership capabilities. It's because their leadership outpaced their character. their leadership outpaced their character. And so what are the things that this passage should teach us about being wise about leadership? What are the takeaways that we should take about and apply to leadership today? First, is that character matters more than charisma. When you're assessing a leader, whether you should follow that person or not, the first question you should ask yourself is not, is this person likable? The question you should ask yourself is this person full of integrity and character? Are they the same person in their home that they are here in the church? Is that the same person that they are in the workplace as they are at the church? See, self-control matters more for a leader than their ability to promote themselves on social media. Self-control will always outpace self-promotion whenever it comes to leadership in the church. The second thing we should look for leadership is this. It's that a godly private life leads to a godly public life. So again, when you're assessing a leader, you should ask yourself this question. Do they actually have spiritual disciplines in place in their life? Does this person, not just because they have to prepare to teach on a Sunday morning, read their Bible, but do they read their Bible because they want to know and love Jesus? Can this person not pray in public and have beautiful prayers written out for other people, but can they pray in their closet and have a relationship with Jesus in that way? See, do these leaders that we want to follow actually cultivate a godly private life? Here's another thing that we will not cultivate within our leaders that makes for a godly private life. It is this person say no. Here's what I mean by that. Does a godly leader have healthy rhythms of Sabbath and rest in their life? We prioritize leaders who can hustle. My CEO at the other company I work for has boasted about working 100-hour weeks before. And I stare at that and I say, that is not godliness. Godliness is not running until you burn out. Godliness means honoring the rhythms of creation and rest that God has created for us in the world. And so can a godly leader have rest? That's a question you should ask yourself. Finally, the third aspect of leadership that we should look at. We've said character matters more than charisma. A godly private life leads to a godly public life. And finally, a leader has to make a lot of noise about Jesus and not about himself or herself. You can tell a lot about a person, whether they are making it about Jesus or whether they are making it about themselves. You can look on their social media. You can look in their public life, in their sermons, in their writings. The question is, are they pointing people towards Jesus, or are they pointing people towards the specific practices that will make them line up more with them in their brand of Christianity and their brand of Jesus? Is it about Jesus, or is it about the person? A godly leader is always pointing away from himself or herself, not pointing towards themselves as the answer to the problem. And so here's what I would encourage you as church members to do. To do two things for your leaders. Pray for them. If you don't regularly pray for me and for Luke, for Trina, for Keely, and for John, for your small group leaders. If you don't pray for them regularly, I'm asking you to pray for them because they need it more than you will know. Secondly, is to hold your leaders accountable. See, as members in the church, your role is to also hold leaders accountable. See, I'm thankful, honestly, in a certain sense, that all of these scandals have come out about these pastors. Because you know what that means is that there was someone that sounded the alarm bell when it needed to be sounded. These leaders who were having sex scandals were not going to oust themselves, but there was a brave young woman, or a brave young man, or a brave staff member who was willing to say, this person shouldn't be doing this. And as leaders in the church, as members in the church, you guys get the privilege of being able to help hold leaders like me accountable to that. If you see things that are happening in my life or in Luke's life that shouldn't be happening, you should say something and not be quiet about it. And those are ways that we can avoid the hypocrisy and the pride and the issues of toxic leadership. And I want to end with this invitation that Jesus makes here at the end. Starting with me in verse 29, read with me to the end here. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify. And some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together, as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The invitation of Jesus is twofold. It's to recognize that we're part of the problem. The Pharisees were unwilling to confess that they had a long lineage of people who were sinners and who had persecuted God's leaders and prophets beforehand. And they were unwilling to recognize that they were going to do the same thing to Jesus himself, the great prophet. They were unwilling to confess and recognize their complicity in the system of sin and oppression that had occurred within that society. So the first step to accepting the invitation of Jesus is, like he says here, is to confess that we are part of the problem of toxic leadership in the church, of toxic leadership in the world. As leaders, we have to humbly accept that we are complicit within that system. But secondly, Jesus invites us to come to him. He uses this illustration of a hen. You can only imagine a mother hen willing to bring in her chicks underneath her wings and hold them there. It's not very often that we picture God as a mother, but in this case we picture God as a mother, willing to embrace her children. If those children would only yet accept their sin and their wrongdoing and come to him, he would embrace them in his arms. And so even leaders who have fallen away from God and who have sinned against God can be brought back into God's fold if yet they would just accept and confess their sins and be brought into his fold. And so he invites us to come to him, Jesus, who's the only non-hypocritical leader that's ever existed in the world. Jesus, who's the only true servant of servants, who came to literally be killed by the people who were full of hypocrisy and pride. Jesus is the true and better servant that we are to lift our eyes to and to trust in him as the great shepherd of his people. Because I'm here to tell you guys, your leaders are going to let you down. We're not perfect. We don't have it all together. But as we sang about earlier, we're all broken vessels. We're all people who God is displaying his power in. Not in spite of our weakness, but because of our weakness. This is how Jesus decided to lead his church, with broken people filled with his Spirit. But yet there is one person who will never let you down. And his name is Jesus. And I'm praying that we would come to him today and trust in him and his cleansing and transformative power in our lives.